If you guys want to grab a Bible, we are in Exodus chapter 18. If you grab one of the red Bibles in the chair in front of you, that's page 67. And we're in this sermon series, Are You Here? And just where we're at right now is actually kind of a pivotal moment in both the book of Exodus, but also in the series. See, if you've been around, you know that we've asked for a number of weeks, where are you stuck in life? And just like the Israelites were stuck in slavery in Egypt, so also we get stuck in life in many places. We get financially stuck or professionally stuck or relationally stuck. We can get stuck in some self-destructive thoughts or some self-destructive behaviors or addictions. And that's what we looked at for really the whole first half of the book. The Israelites were stuck in slavery waiting for their exodus. But over the last 2 weeks, we came to that moment where God brought freedom to his people, freedom from slavery, and there's a shift now of focusing less on where are you stuck and focusing now on saying, if God has brought you freedom, how do you live into that? How do you stay on that course? And we've celebrated some great stories because here in this room, you might not know this, you might be aware of this, but here in this room are people who have felt stuck. Maybe stuck for decades in some difficult relationship, maybe stuck in really painful self-destructive thoughts or behaviors. There are people in this room who have been stuck and who have looked to God and are finding freedom. And that's, can I get like an amen or something like that? Does anybody do that around here? But what we've realized is just because we turn and look to God and say, God, I'm going to stop looking in all the right places, I'm going to start looking stop looking in the wrong places and start looking in the right place. Just because we do that once doesn't mean we magically have it figured out, but we now need to do the work of saying, God, I'm going to stay on this path, not to earn your presence, but to keep myself focused on you, because we all know that so often, even though we see the right way to go, we get distracted and we say, maybe I'm going to go back over here again sometimes. And so in this critical moment, in this pivotal moment in the story, we again take a little bit of a pause from the main narrative, and we're going to look at what might seem like a side issue, but I think we're going to find out it's actually crucial to the story. So in a minute, we're going to review kind of some of the main plot using our Bible Project video that we've been looking at for a while. But first, I want to talk to you about the main idea we're looking at this morning, and that is the idea of mentoring. Have you guys ever mentored somebody in your life? Have you ever been mentored by somebody in your life? I want to give you two stories to kind of call to mind, maybe to remind you or introduce you to what is meant when we talk about mentoring. Two people come to my mind in my story. The first one is a guy that I've talked about before. His name is John Lundberg. Now, when I was a fifth grade boy, I went to summer camp, and John Lundberg was my camp counselor. And I loved camp so much that when I got old enough, I decided I want to be a counselor just like John Lundberg. And you know, when I became a counselor, John Lundberg was the head counselor. He was the program director in charge of all the counselors. So he started as my counselor, and then when I became a counselor, he was my program director. And then after I'd been a counselor for a while, I got the opportunity to become the program director, and John and I stayed in touch as I stepped into that role. And so I look at my relationship with John, and what I notice is he was my counselor, he was a program director, he was like over me, but he never really formally mentored me. He never sat down and was like, Carl, I'm going to be your mentor, and we're going to meet once and we're going to talk about this. He never formally mentored me, and yet, during those years and years of time, I looked to him so often for help, for encouragement, for advice. He spoke into my life so significantly in so many ways that I look back and I say, John Lundberg was a profound mentor to me. Have you ever had a relationship like this? I see a lot of good, I see a lot of nodding heads. And you know that it doesn't have to be a formal process in order for it to be a meaningful mentoring relationship, right? So when we talk about mentoring, we can talk about things casual and informal and circumstantial. The second story that comes to mind is from right here at this church. Our previous lead pastor, Steve Tulson, many of you know him very well, maybe better than me. A few of you maybe have never met him, but our previous lead pastor, his name was Steve Tulson. And I was the youth pastor for a number of years. And at one point, Steve came to me and said, Carl, I think and I thought this too, I think God's maybe leading you to become a lead pastor someday. We didn't know that was going to happen here. Spoiler alert, it happened here. I became, you guys might have figured that out. But Steve came to me and said, here's what I think, Carl. I would like to mentor you. And Steve and I created a formal 2-year mentoring plan. It got approved by the council. You might have been here. We announced it to the congregation. And Steve took 2 years to purposefully and formally look at, reflect on the 40 years of ministry experience he had and say, how can I share that with, give it to Carl? And so in contrast with my relationship with John Lundberg, Steve Tulson purposefully, formally, in a process, he sat me down and he mentored me, preparing me for what was ahead. In both of these instances, these two men, their mentoring in my life was a huge benefit in helping me stay on the path that God was leading me on. In both instances, I think God had already showed me, spoken to me, revealed to me some of the direction he was putting me on in my life. But in both of these instances, my mentor made it easier for me to stay focused in moving the direction I needed to move. So here's what I want to ask you. In your life, who has been a mentor to you? Maybe even if you want, open up your programs and I put a little space on the top. Maybe even right now, jot down their name. Jot down, like, where did that happen? When was it? How did you meet them? How did you connect with them? Take a minute to just remember and think about the people who have significantly mentored you in your life. Maybe even, I don't know, maybe even this afternoon. Go home and shoot them a little text or an email like, hey, preacher talked about mentoring and you came to my mind. And so just thank you. That's what it looks like when you text people. Because mentors can be significant people in our lives. And if you've been blessed by a mentor, you know just how meaningful it can be. And it turns out that the chapter we come to today is a story about how our main character, Moses, gets mentored by what might be considered an unlikely person in his life. Maybe not, maybe so. I'll let you decide. But before we get there, check out this video reminding us of where we've been so far in the book of Exodus.
The book of Exodus. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 through 18, which tell the foundational story of how God rescued the enslaved Israelites by confronting and defeating Pharaoh, while offering a way of escape through the blood of the Passover lamb. God then delivered his people by bringing them through the waters of the sea and then into the wilderness, where, surprisingly, they grumbled and complained. Now, the second half of the book of Exodus opens as Moses leads Israel to the foot of Mount Sinai, where God invites the nation of Israel to enter into a covenant relationship. And here we reach another key moment in the biblical storyline, because this is picking up and developing God's promise to Abraham. So remember, from the book of Genesis, God promised that through Abraham's family, somehow he would restore his blessing to all of the nations. And here we find out more. God says that if Israel obeys the terms of the covenant, they will be so shaped by God's laws and teaching and justice that they will become a kingdom of priests, which means that they will become God's representatives and show all of the other nations what God is truly like.
So as you can see, we're in chapter 18, and chapter 18 is literally, at least according to this guy's interpretation, it's a pretty good one. Chapter 18 is literally at the turning point between the first half of the story, Israelites enslaved, finding freedom, and the second half of the story, Israel meeting with God on Mount Sinai and making official the relationship that has already been established. And at this pivotal moment, you'll notice that actually what we're about to talk about, this guy doesn't even mention it in the storyline. At this pivotal moment in the story, we get a scene, a part of the narrative, that too often gets skipped over. And I'm going to tell you why in just a second. But I want to try and make it sink in just how critical this pivotal moment is. So here we are. I'm going to read a few chunks of Exodus chapter 18, starting with verse 1. Now, Jethro, this is chapter 18, verse 1. Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And after this, the author goes on to explaining how Jethro sort of, he came into the picture a while ago, but then he's been out of the picture for a little bit, and it explains how why he's back in the picture with Israel now. And so Jethro is back with Moses now. The Israelites have crossed the Red Sea. They've complained to God, and God has provided for them again. And Jethro is now showing up to join the Israelites in this new journey on their own, that they're on. And the story continues. Jethro, surprisingly, was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel and rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." And it's really interesting because at this point in the story, we actually don't know much about Jethro. When we met him, we know that he was a Midianite. He lived in this middle of nowhere place called Midian. We know that he was a priest of Midian, but we don't know what priest of Midian means. We don't know if that means he's a Yahweh worshiper like Israel, or if he worships some other religion. We don't know who Jethro is. We also know that he's a shepherd, did I get that right? You guys are kicking, thank you, Mike stuff, figured it out. We also know that Jethro is a shepherd, and while maybe he's a well-off shepherd, he's sort of just a living on the outside of things shepherd. And so all that to say, Jethro is sort of this strange character who now suddenly has acknowledged that the Lord is greater than all other gods. And so maybe this is a conversion moment. Maybe he has just started to worship Yahweh. Maybe he has before. We don't really know. And I think that might be the point. Well, Jethro is now back with his son-in-law Moses. And here's how the story continues. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Well, Moses' father-in-law Jethro has some opinions about it, and he responds and says, Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave." And not only does Jethro point out that what Moses is doing is bad, but apparently Jethro, the priest of Midian, shepherd from the middle of nowhere, apparently he has some strong opinions about just how to organize and administrate a national judicial system. Because he goes on to say, here's what you need to do. You need to recruit some leaders, and you need to put some of them in charge of 1,000 people, and others in charge of 100, and others in charge of 50, and then you need to get small group leaders and everybody in a group of 10. And Jethro goes on this long discussion of how Moses should stop being the only Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he needs to start recruiting other judges to sit and organize this judicial system. Because apparently, even when you're Israel who has just been miraculously freed from slavery by God, apparently you still get in legal arguments with one another and need judges to come and mediate your disputes. So Jethro explains this all and then sums up. Moses listened to his father-in-law. Good work, Moses. And did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over the thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided for themselves. So here's what I want to do. I observe in this story that Moses and sort of metaphorically as well, all of Israel, were just miraculously freed by God from slavery. And at this critical moment, we get a story about how Moses himself, at this just really highlight moment, actually needs somebody to come alongside him and mentor him and speak into his life. And so I want to make 3 observations about how it was that Moses benefited from this mentoring, that we might also benefit from it as well. But before I get to those 3 observations, one other point I want to highlight. And it's an exegetical problem. It's if you're paying close attention to the story, there's this phrase that shows up twice. Moses should teach the decrees and instructions of God to the people. But here's my question. How is it that Moses is teaching Israel the decrees and instructions of God? See, the phrase, that phrase, decrees and instructions, it's a kind of a technical phrase that seems to be referring to the commandments God gives on Mount Sinai. But we're not at Mount Sinai yet. That's actually next chapter. Moses does not have any decrees or instructions from God to teach Israel. And so what we have is most likely a small story that has been purposefully put here out of the timeline of the rest of the story. And I want to say 2 things about that. First, we talked about this before in one of our first weeks. Exodus is not a history book. When Moses sat down to write the book of Exodus, he did not sit down and go, I am going to write a detailed history in perfect chronological order so that everybody knows exactly the timeline of the events. When we have history books in school and stuff, that's what we do. And history books are great things. Moses was not writing a history book. Moses was writing a theology textbook. Moses was sitting down to write a book to teach Israel, generation after generation after generation, where their relationship with God began and what kind of a relationship it was. We're not reading history, we're reading theology. And therefore, if we see things that don't look historically reliable or they look out of order, we should be fine with that. Now, Moses is using history to tell his theology. So saying that this is theology and not history doesn't mean these are not historical incidences. It doesn't mean he's not telling the story. What it does mean is we shouldn't get bogged down in concerns that aren't the concerns of the author. Rather, we should ask ourselves, so what point is Moses trying to make by taking this story from out of order and placing it here? And here's the point that I think he's trying to make. The point is that as God is doing his miraculous work in the lives of God's people, and for us, as we see God doing great works in our own lives, there are still some very practical issues that we must attend to. The presence of God and thoughtfulness about practical things are not 2 separate or different issues, but rather they are often 2 parts of the same thing. And here's my attempt to give 3 observations from Moses' experience that maybe, just maybe, will be beneficial in our lives as well. First of all, even the greatest leaders need mentors. I mean, if you were to make a list across history of the greatest leaders from all times and all places, I think Moses would likely show up on that short list, maybe even be near the top. Certainly in terms of leaders from among Scripture, Moses is the leader among leaders. I mean, this is the guy. This is the moment. God has called his people and freed them from slavery, and Moses is the one God chose to lead them out. And then Moses is the one who helps them go from nomadic herdsmen to an organized nation, to go from recovering from slavery to being God's chosen and blessed people. Moses is a phenomenal leader. Now, here's the interesting thing that I think can happen when we think about mentoring in our lives. I don't believe this, and I think many of you don't believe this either, but I think it can show up. We can inadvertently think to ourselves, oh, well, if I'm weak, or if I'm not very good, or if I don't have the skills, or if I'm not smart enough, maybe then I need a mentor. But once I'm good enough, smart enough, skilled enough, I've learned enough, then I probably don't need a mentor anymore. But what we see here is exactly the opposite. Moses has been having unbelievable encounters with God and doing great things as a leader, and yet still, he needs and benefits from somebody speaking into his life. And in fact, we actually see this same thing played out in so many different areas. I did a little research and I found three actually pretty famous mentoring pairs that I didn't realize about that I'll just give as an example. So first, Mark Zuckerberg, you might have heard of him. He made this little website called Facebook. Arguably one of the greatest software engineers turned one of the greatest business leaders. Okay, there's all sorts of controversy around Facebook. Let's not focus on that right now. Let's just focus on it has become a massively successful organization, and Mark Zuckerberg's at the center of it all. Well, Mark Zuckerberg was mentored for many years by, in a sense, his predecessor, the head of Apple, Steve Jobs. And so even though Mark Zuckerberg is arguably the most talented software engineer of ever, because there weren't software engineers, very long ago, yet still, he sought out and benefited from having a mentor in his life. Here's another one, Oprah Winfrey. She's done so much with the media, entertainment world and has just innovated in so many incredible ways. And in her early years and also, for many years continuing on in life, Barbara Walters was a mentor to her. And then the third one, Bill Gates, another tech giant, has become one of the richest men in the world. Maybe he's the richest now. I don't pay much attention to that. But Bill was, and actually for many, many years has continued a very close friendship with Warren Buffett, another one of the richest men in the world. And it's that friendship out of which came the two of their commitments to give away huge portions of their wealth and to challenge other billionaires to give away huge portions of their wealth. So we see both in the story of Exodus, but we also see in popular culture in general, it's not the weak who need mentors, but rather it's anybody who wants to move forward in their journey. It's anybody who wants to grow and get better and get stronger, whether you're weak or strong, whether you're inexperienced or highly experienced, anybody who wants to continue moving down God's path in life is going to benefit from a mentor. And indeed, we actually see that same concept in the book of Proverbs. The author of this proverb says, "Instruct the wise, and they will be wiser still. Teach the righteous, and they will add to their learning." So we see that even among the wisest, most righteous, most learned people, further instruction, further guidance, further mentoring will only move them further along in their path. Second thing I observe, outsiders often make great mentors. It just strikes me, in the examples I put on the screen, Steve Jobs mentors Mark Zuckerberg, and Steve is, clearly a gifted and in the same business area as Mark Zuckerberg, and all those examples, they sort of match. But in this example of Moses and Jethro, we have a little bit of a mismatch. We now have Moses, the leader of a massive nation of people, who's sitting as the chief justice for all of the nation, trying to, rule judiciously for all of these cases. And we have his shepherd, priest of Midian father-in-law from the middle of nowhere. We have no reason to think Jethro has any expertise, any knowledge, any wisdom in the area of, administrating a nation's judicial system. And yet, I think the implication is because Jethro is an outsider, sometimes outsiders can come and see things that you simply cannot see. Not because they know more or have more knowledge, but simply because they see it from a different perspective. And oftentimes, seeing things from a different perspective is the key to coming to the decision, to choosing the course of action that you need to make. One of the greatest examples that I can think of comes from the Gospels, an example of somebody who is a complete outsider, who yet sets a profound example from others. The story goes, Jesus is carrying out his ministry. And Jesus is walking around, he's teaching people, he's healing people, and many, many people are coming to him. And one guy in particular comes to him who is a Roman soldier. And not just any Roman soldier, but he is a centurion, which means he is a soldier who is a leader of many, many other soldiers. Now, if you know this part of the New Testament story, the Romans were not very liked by the Jewish people. See, because the Romans were the oppressors. The Romans to the first century Jews were like the Egyptians to the enslaved Jews in the Old Testament. So Jesus is now standing face to face with the most outsider bad guy you can imagine, right? And I can sort of envision everybody in the crowds like look and be like, oh boy, Jesus is going to talk to a centurion like, what's going to happen? This could not end well. Like zap him. Come on, somebody zap him. Like there's a lot of tension in this scene. So the centurion says to Jesus, hey, I've got somebody sick at my home. Will you heal them? And Jesus says, yeah, show me the way. So take me to your house. And the centurion says, no, stop right there. I am a centurion. That means I have soldiers that I'm in charge of, right? I know that if I tell them what to do, they're going to do it. I don't need to follow them, and I don't need to check up on them. I just know that if I tell them what to do, they're going to do it because I'm in charge and they follow my orders. And he looks at Jesus and he says, I know that if you just say the word, it'll be done. And when Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, he's looking around at a group of Jewish people. Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Jesus sets an example of faith by looking to the most outside person imaginable. And so it is with us when we're looking for mentors sometimes. When we're getting so stuck in a problem and we just can't see it, we need to look to outsiders to give us help. One story that somebody shared with me was the idea of, it's kind of like when you are in an interview, and imagine you're in a job interview and you're talking and you're like, oh, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And then there's this one interview question that's sometimes really weird. And they're like, so what do you think your blind spots are? Well, if they're really my blind spots, I'm pretty sure I can't see them. The only way we can see our blind spots is by inviting somebody from the outside to look and see the things that we can't see ourselves. Third thing that I noticed from this text is what we said at the beginning. Divine guidance. And when I'm talking about divine guidance, I'm talking about everything we've said up to this point, right? God called Moses. God spoke his intentions to the Israelites. God, through Moses, freed Israel from slavery. God has been doing incredible things. And then we stop and we get some advice on what I would call very practical administrative details about the nation's organizational structure. And I think sometimes we have this temptation to be like, oh, well, either God's going to show up in a divine, miraculous way, or I guess we have to have some practical advice and just think through this. But this story just seems to say, no. Divine guidance actually includes practical advice. Those are not two separate and removed from one another. Those are actually two parts of the exact same thing. And that, I think, is why this story has been put right into the middle, because I can only imagine that as this story is being passed down to Israel generation after generation after generation, there might be an Israelite somewhere along the way, or there might be a group of Jesus followers somewhere thousands of years later who go, okay. God did those great things then, and I believe he can do it now, but sometimes I don't see the same sort of miraculous work, so what am I supposed to do? Well, sometimes what God wants you to do is get a mentor in your life who can give you some practical advice on, we've been following God for a long time. These are the things you should do. What you're doing is not good. You should do this instead. You're making some bad decisions. Here's a better decision to make instead, because divine guidance often includes practical advice. And I think Moses puts this right here at the center place of the story to remind us that as we're following God and God is doing great things in our lives, we should not forget about the simple, commonplace, relational ways that God shows up as well. So what does that mean for us? If you are training to follow God, this is what we said last week. If God showed up in your life, if you were stuck, but you didn't want to stay stuck, you wanted to find freedom, and God showed up and gave you freedom, then that you have started down a new path, but you know that you don't simply try really hard to walk that path, but you need to train yourself to become a person who stays on that path, because we so often turn away. The Israelites turned away. They're going to turn away again and again. We turn away from God in our own lives. We forget about him again and again. So we need to be training to stay on the path. And if you're training to follow God with your life, you and I need a mentor. Because mentors are people who can speak into your life to help you stay on the path, be more focused, and go further along than you would on your own. If Moses needed a mentor, benefited from a mentor, then we most certainly do as well. And here's the really good news. For many of us, we're completely surrounded by potential mentors to begin with. There might be people in your life group. You know, if you're around half of the people in our church are in life groups. If you're not in a life group, let us know. We want to get you in a life group. They're awesome. If you're in a life group, there might be some people around you who are already in that context mentoring you, or might be available to mentor you further. We know that in friendships, oftentimes mentoring can happen in a more informal way, simply in friendships. When friends are honest with one another and authentic to one another and speak into one another's lives, that can be a mentoring relationship. Sometimes in families, whether like Moses, it was his father-in-law, or healthy, parent-child relationships, or even healthy brother-sister relationships, we can be mentored in these circumstances. You might be surrounded by already potential mentors. And we know that mentoring can actually show up in so many different genres of life as well. It can show up professionally in your work. Some workplaces have professional mentoring relationships. It can show up personally. You need a sort of personal relational guidance, personal relation help. It can be a spiritual thing where you're looking for somebody to mentor you on prayer or on study of God's word. But mentoring, not this small, narrow, little boxed-in thing. Mentoring rather is a powerful tool that God can use in so many different ways in our lives. And so here's what I want to challenge you to consider. In your life, right? In your life, if you've been tracking with this Exodus story, hopefully in your life, you've acknowledged that you're stuck somewhere, but stuck isn't where you want to stay. And in this church, we've acknowledged that there are people right now who are experiencing freedom because they're getting their eyes off themselves and off all the wrong places, and they're getting their eyes on God. But like Moses, just because our eyes are on God doesn't mean we suddenly don't need help, but rather it makes us more aware of the help we need to continue on that path. So here's my question. Have you admitted, while you're walking this path, while you're trying to follow God, while you're trying to train yourself to stay on the path God has set you, have you admitted where you need help in continuing on that journey, right? Maybe you're like Moses and you need help organizing your life. Or maybe you have organization down, no problem, that's super easy, but you've got some serious relational struggles or challenges, and you need somebody who's a little further down the relationship path to come alongside you and speak into you. Maybe you've got young kids and you want to follow God with your family, but you need somebody whose kids are a little older who can come alongside you and speak into your life. Maybe your kids are all out of the house now and you're looking around, freaking out, going, what do I do now that the kids are out of the house? Or maybe you're celebrating now that the kids are out of the house. I don't know. But maybe you need somebody who went through that a few years ago to come alongside you. Or maybe you just retired and you don't know what it's like to be retired. Or maybe you're celebrating, but you want somebody a little further down the road to come and say, hey, let me help you figure out what this new season of life is like. Whatever it is, have you admitted, not the area you're stuck, but as you're trying to follow God, have you admitted the area where you are in greatest need of help staying on this path? Second thing, what would it look like if you just looked around your life? Look around your life groups, look around your friendships, look around this church, look around in your family. If you looked around your life and you identified, who are some people in my life that could possibly mentor me? I mean, who are they? Make a list. Write them down. Start doing it right now if you want. Maybe it's something formal, like Steve did for me in a formal way in the church. Maybe it's something informal, like my mentor at camp. But I don't know. Who are the people in your life that you look around and you go, you know what? I'd love to hear that person's thoughts on parenting or on work or on faith. I'd love to hear their thoughts. I think I could benefit from hearing what they say. Now, here comes the tricky part. Maybe not the tricky part, but here comes the part that is a little bigger ask. Would you go up to that person and ask them to mentor you? Or if you feel like, I don't know if I want to do it directly, or maybe I don't have anybody that comes to mind, would you reach out to us as a church and say, you know what, I'd love to be mentored? Or maybe you can, I think, humbly but honestly say, I'd actually love to mentor somebody. I don't know if that's an option. I'd love to mentor somebody. Would you actually acknowledge the need, identify some possible people, and then take the step to say, I'd like to do that? Now, I want to make this really easy for you. Here's what this could look like. You could walk up to somebody and you could say to them, hey, can I talk to you about something? And you know what'll happen if you go up to somebody and say, hey, can I talk to you about something? They're going to go, yeah, sure. What do you want to talk about? And then you say, well, yeah, I mean, I know that your kids are older than mine, and I'm just, I could really use somebody. I was wondering if you and I could get together and just talk about parenting every once in a while. That's it. Maybe you don't like that question. Here's another one. Hey, I wanted to ask you something, right? Sure. What do you want to ask me? Or possibly be a little more direct. Hey, could you give me some advice? I mean, I'm struggling with this thing. And I know that you're a little further down the road. Maybe you don't have the answers and I'm struggling. Now, two things might happen. Here's one thing that I think might well happen, is that person might go, wow, thanks for asking. That's super thoughtful. I mean, I can't believe you would think of me. Like, wow. Because people that you identify as probably a good mentor, probably one of the reasons you look at them is because you see a humility in their life that's attractive. And so they might be like, wow, thanks so much for asking. You might also hear them say, really? You want to hear my advice on this? No, I don't have this figured out at all. Sure, my kids are older. Sure, I'm further down the professional path. Sure, I've been a Christian longer, but I don't know if I've got it figured out. When they say that, ignore them and say, yes, I want to get together with you and hear what you have to say. But whatever it is, are you in need, as you're following Jesus, of the help that only an outsider can give, speaking into your life, supporting you, encouraging you on the way so that you can go farther down the road that God is calling you? If indeed you want the church to help you out, on your Connect cards, you've got your Connect cards, pull them out right now. On your Connect cards, I put 2 boxes. You don't have to do it with us. You can totally do this on your own. But if you want the church help, if you feel like, I would love to have a mentor, there's a box that says, yep, I would love to be mentored by somebody. I can't make any promises, but we'd love to try and connect you to somebody who could be a mentor. Or maybe you're sitting there going, you know what? I don't know if I have everything figured out, but I've been doing this for a while. I'd be interested. Yeah, I'd be interested in considering being a mentor for somebody. And at the very least, I want to let the church know if that's you, check the box. But here's the biggest thing that we need to walk away with. Wherever you're at in your life of faith, you need somebody else. You probably need lots of other people, but this term mentoring can refer to sort of a specific, for a season, you need other people speaking into your life to help you stay focused on the path that God has put you on. And my hope is that if that's you right now, you would take this challenge, this invitation seriously, and make a step to invite somebody else to speak into your life in that way. Would you pray with me? God, I'm struck again by how significant it is that this great leader of yours, Moses, who has done incredible things with your presence, he was benefited, he was strengthened, he was encouraged in a somewhat unlikely place. He was made a better leader because of this man Jethro who came and spoke into his life and mentored him. And so, God, I pray for us right now. If there's anybody in this room who is in a place where they would deeply benefit from and where you're prompting them to say, yes, you should reach out and get somebody to speak into your life that way, I pray that, God, they would take the step, that they'd identify somebody, that they'd ask somebody, that they'd invite them to coffee, that they would make this happen so that we as a community might never be alone in our journey of following you, but we might always be doing it together. And if there's anybody that could be a blessing by being a mentor to others, may that as well be a step that with humility and honestly they say, yeah, I think God might be setting me up for that. And may we as a church be a place connecting people in community and in relationship following you. Amen.